The United States once spent money putting millions of carp into American waters. More than a century later, in some places, officials are spending money trying to get certain carp back out. That alone is strange, but it gets even stranger. Back in the 1800s, carp were shipped across the country by rail. Newspapers celebrated them. People actually showed up to collect the fish. Today, a lot of Americans wouldn't even want one on their dinner plate. So what happened? How did a fish once promoted as a valuable food source become one of the least desirable fish in America? And here's the part that makes this story even more confusing. The carp Americans complain about for tasting muddy, the carp they see flying out of rivers, and the carp connected to certain health warnings aren't necessarily the same problem. So let's go back to where all of this started. The story begins in 1877. At the time, native fish populations in parts of the United States were declining because of overfishing and pollution. Spencer Baird, the head of the U.S. Fish Commission, wanted a fish that could survive in conditions where other species struggled. Carp looked almost perfect. They were hardy, they could eat just about anything. They grew quickly, and they reproduced extremely well. So the government imported carp from Germany, raised them in ponds near Washington, D.C., and began breeding them in huge numbers. Then they shipped them across the country. Farmers received them. Fish growers received them. Communities far from the coast suddenly had access to a reliable source of fresh fish. At the time, carp weren't viewed as a problem. They were viewed as a solution. And the plan worked. Almost too well. Because the exact thing that made carp such a great fish to introduce also made them incredibly hard to control. Carp didn't just survive. They spread. They competed with native fish for food. And common carp have a feeding habit that can cause serious problems in shallow rivers and lakes. They dig around in the bottom looking for food. That stirs up sediment. The water gets cloudier. Aquatic plants can suffer. And other species that depend on those plants and habitats can be affected too. Within a few decades, the public image of carp began to change. Newspapers that had once praised the fish started calling it a nuisance. Anglers didn't want to keep them. Restaurants gradually stopped serving them. But the biggest problem wasn't just ecological. It was cultural. One generation stopped eating carp. The next generation grew up watching them avoid it. And eventually, people didn't even need to know why carp had a bad reputation. They just knew it did. But that raises an obvious question. If carp is really such terrible food, why do millions of people in other parts of the world still choose to eat it? Go to parts of Central Europe around Christmas, and carp has a completely different image. In countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, carp has long been part of traditional holiday meals. In Jewish cuisine, carp has also been used in dishes like gefilte fish. So clearly, this isn't as simple as saying, carp just tastes bad. That said, Americans didn't invent every reason to dislike it. Carp can be a pain to eat. The first problem is bones. Carp have lots of small intramuscular bones, often described as Y bones, running through the meat. This isn't the kind of fish you fillet in a few seconds and throw straight into a pan. Preparing it well takes skill. The second problem is flavor. Common carp often feed close to the bottom, around mud and sediment. Depending on the water they come from, that can give the meat an earthy or muddy taste. In cultures where carp is commonly eaten, people developed ways to deal with that. One method is keeping the fish in clean water before cooking it. But here's the problem. Most Americans are used to convenient, mild, nearly boneless fish. So why would they spend extra time preparing a fish they already think is bad? And just when carp's reputation was already in trouble, America brought in another group of fish. And these fish would become famous for something completely different. In the 1970s, aquaculture facilities in the southern United States imported several Asian carp species, including silver carp and bighead carp. They weren't brought in to become America's next popular dinner fish. They were used in aquaculture systems to help control algae and other unwanted material in the water. They were supposed to stay contained. They didn't. After flooding in the Mississippi River Basin over the following decades, some escaped into natural waterways. Then they did what carp do extremely well. They survived, they reproduced, and they spread. Silver carp and bighead carp feed on plankton, which sits near the base of the aquatic food chain. As their populations grew, so did concerns about competition with native species. But silver carp had another problem, a much more visible one. They jump. The sound of boat engines can startle them, causing fish to launch themselves out of the water, and when there are enough of them, it can look insane. Dozens of fish can suddenly explode into the air. They hit boats, they hit equipment. Sometimes they hit people. Those videos spread across television and the internet. And suddenly, the word carp didn't just mean a bony fish with a bad reputation. Now it meant invasive fish flying at your face. But here's the twist. Those aren't the same carp that created America's original muddy fish reputation. Common carp and silver carp don't even feed the same way. Common carp spend a lot of time rooting around near the bottom. Silver carp and bighead carp are filter feeders. They mainly eat plankton suspended in the water. So one of the classic complaints about common carp, that muddy, earthy flavor associated with bottom feeding, doesn't automatically apply in the same way to silver carp. And the meat of these Asian carp species has been described as mild, white, and flaky. Closer to fish Americans already eat than the word carp would make you expect. So America ended up with a strange branding problem. One fish built the bad reputation. Another fish inherited it. People heard the word carp and remembered muddy flavor. Then they saw invasive fish taking over rivers. Then they watched silver carp jumping into boats. Different fish, different behaviors, different problems. But one name tied all of them together. And once a name becomes toxic, changing people's minds can be harder than changing the product itself. So some people tried something much simpler. They changed the name. In Louisiana, chef Philippe Parola promoted Asian carp under a different name, Silverfin. The idea was pretty straightforward. If customers rejected the fish the moment they saw the word carp, maybe they would be more willing to try it under a different name. The fish could be deboned, ground, and turned into fish cakes, sandwiches, and other easy-to-eat products. But the story gets even more ironic. Some carp caught in the United States could be processed and exported to markets in Asia and the Middle East, where the fish didn't carry the same stigma. Think about that. America had too many of these fish. Americans didn't really want to eat them. Officials wanted their numbers reduced. Fishermen caught them. Processors cleaned them. And then consumers somewhere else bought them as food. In some areas, government programs have even supported commercial harvesting to help reduce invasive carp populations. At that point, eating the fish becomes more than a food choice. It becomes population control. Catch more fish, reduce their numbers, turn an ecological problem into a product. And if the story ended there, it would be easy to say Americans were simply being picky. But there was one more issue, and this one had nothing to do with branding. Beginning in the 1970s, environmental agencies started testing fish more systematically for contaminants like mercury, PCBs, and industrial pollution. And this created another problem for common carp. Because common carp often live and feed near the bottom, they can be exposed to contaminants that collect in sediment. In polluted waterways, that matters. Testing in some areas found contaminant levels high enough for health agencies to recommend limiting consumption of certain locally caught fish. In some cases, advisories warned people not to eat particular fish from specific bodies of water. That doesn't mean all carp everywhere are unsafe. The risk depends on the species, the location, and the quality of the water. But look at what happened to carp's reputation over time. First, it's too bony. Then, it tastes muddy. Then, it damages ecosystems. Then these carp are jumping into boats. And finally, some fish from polluted waterways may carry contaminants. Different problems, different species, different decades. But eventually, all of it got compressed into one simple idea: carp is bad. And that's what makes this story so strange. More than a century ago, the United States spent money putting carp into American waters because people wanted more fish to eat. Today, in some places, money is being spent trying to remove invasive carp from those same river systems. Some chefs have changed the name just to convince people to try it. Some processors catch the fish in America and sell it to people overseas. But maybe the hardest thing to remove was never the fish, it was the reputation.